gained and received in wealth, what have you ever done for your country as a good citizen?
Well, I don't know what you claim, what you mean by that.
Well, you're looking back over the years now to that time when you became a citizen. I mean, now standing 20-odd years after that. You must have in your mind some things you've done that you can speak of to your credit as an American citizen. If so, what are they?
Paid my tax.
When you think of the American Mafia, you probably picture a stereotype. A hot-headed street thug, the brutal enforcer, the man who lives and dies by the gun. But one man defied that mold. He was a thinker, a master of backroom politics who would rather buy a politician than bury a rival. He was Francesco Castiglia, a street kid from East Harlem, New York, who became Frank Costello, the prime minister of the underworld. His story isn't one of bloody gang wars, but of a quiet, calculated rise to power that fundamentally changed the face of organized crime in America. Welcome back to James on the Mob. I'm James Jenkins, host and narrator. Today we're tracing the journey of that alto knight, Frank Costello, from his first arrest as a young hoodlum to his final days as a respected elder statesman of the mob. This is the story of Frank Costello's ascent and the legacy of a man who proved that the mind, not the gun, was the ultimate weapon. Frank Costello's story begins not in America, but in the poor, rugged region of Calabria, Italy, where he was born Francesco Castiglia in 1891. At the age of 4, his family brought him to the United States, settling in the tough East Harlem section of Manhattan. From an early age, Costello was driven by a powerful desire to escape poverty and his father's passive acceptance of it. He left school in the 5th grade and turned to street crime, rifling vending machines and engaging in petty theft. As a teenager, he became the leader of the 104th Street Gang, an Italian gang based in Harlem, and was also active in the notorious 5 Points Gang in Lower Manhattan. This early period of his life was anything but quiet. Between 1908 and 1918, he was jailed at least 4 times for offenses including assault, robbery, and weapons possession. But a turning point arrived in 1918 after he served a 10-month sentence for armed robbery. Upon his release, Costello made a life-altering decision. He vowed to give up violence and use his mind as his primary weapon. A choice so foundational that as mob boss, he reportedly never carried a gun. It was this rejection of brute force that would set him apart from his contemporaries and pave the way for his unique career. In 1918, he also married Loretta Bobby Geigerman, a Jewish woman whose parents had immigrated from Germany. She would be by Frank's side all his life. It was during this period that Costello met Charlie Lucky Luciano, the Sicilian leader of a Lower East Side gang. The two men immediately became friends and partners. Several older Sicilian mobsters in Luciano's circles disapproved of this growing partnership. They were mostly old-school mafiosi who were unwilling to work with anyone who was not Italian and skeptical at best about working with non-Sicilians. To Luciano's shock, they warned him against working with Costello, whom they called the Dirty Calabrian. Luciano, recognizing Costello's worth, disregarded the old-timers who he considered close-minded mustache Pete's. And with the passage of the Prohibition Act in 1920, which was a godsend for a new generation of American mobsters, Frank Costello was at the forefront. It was during this period that he formed the most powerful criminal alliances in American organized crime history. Along with his close friend and partner, Luciano, they partnered with Jewish mobsters, Meyer Lansky and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, Dutch Schultz and Louis Lepke Buckhalter, Irish mobsters like Owen the Killer Madden and William Big Bill Dwyer, and other Italian mobsters like Thomas Three Finger Brown Lucchese, Albert Anastasia, and Vito Genovese. Operating out of the now demolished Hotel Claridge in Times Square, this group became known as the Broadway Mob. Their bootlegging operation was backed by the legendary gambler Arnold the Brain Rothstein, who also became a mentor to the young men, teaching them how to act and dress in high society, and how to treat the business of crime as a business. Costello's specific value to the group was not his ability to run a violent criminal operation, but his unmatched skill at political corruption. He was the talker of the group, the man who forged alliances with Tammany Hall, the powerful Democratic political machine in New York. These connections gave the mob a crucial protective shield, allowing them to buy favors of politicians, judges, district attorneys, cops, city officials, and anyone else they needed to bribe, to operate their rackets with impunity. He and Luciano even stayed in the same hotel as Tammany delegates at the 1932 Democratic National Convention, where he reportedly helped secure Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidential nomination. In this new world, Costello's political influence was far more valuable an asset than any muscle could ever be. The old order of the American Mafia was about to face its final test. The Castello-Morese War, a brutal gang conflict that raged roughly from 1930 through 1931, pitted two old guard mustache Petes, Joe Mazzaria and Salvador Maranzano, against one another, as the young Americanized mobsters watched in the wings. The old guard was rigid, violent, and refused to work with non-Italians. And for Costello and Luciano, who were running a modern, multi-ethnic business, this endless violence was simply bad for business. At first, Costello and Luciano backed Joe the Boss Mazzaria, but as the tide of the war started going in favor of Maranzano, the other mustache, Luciano betrayed his own boss, Mazzaria, having him gunned down in a Coney Island restaurant in April of 1931. Maranzano, believing he had won, declared himself boss of all bosses. This antiquated dictatorial title was a direct affront to the modern, syndicated vision of Luciano and Costello. So they had Maranzano assassinated just 5 months later on September 10, 1931. The coup was a masterstroke, and it ended the war, ushering in a new era of cooperation and stability. Luciano became the new head of New York's most powerful crime family and established the Five Family Commission for the Italian families and the National Crime Syndicate, in which members of the commission worked in league with mobsters of other ethnicities. Vito Genovese was named underboss, and Frank Costello was named consigliere, or top advisor, of the Luciano family. As Luciano family consigliere, Costello was given control of the family's most profitable non-violent ventures. His specialty was gambling, and he quickly became one of the family's top earners. His empire included an estimated 25,000 slot machines placed in bars, restaurants, and gas stations throughout New York. When New York's reform-minded mayor, Fiorello LaGuardia, targeted his operation, Costello simply moved it to Louisiana. He had already secured a deal with Governor Huey Long, which gave the Louisiana political machine a 10% cut of the profits in exchange for their tacit political protection, and with New Orleans mafia boss Carlos Marcello for the machine's physical protection. Costello also expanded the family's reach by investing in illegal gambling in Florida and Cuba. The path to the top, however, was paved by two unforeseen events. In June of 1936, Special Prosecutor Thomas E. Dewey successfully prosecuted Lucky Luciano for a widespread prostitution ring. Luciano was sentenced to a staggering 30 to 50 years in prison. With Luciano in jail, his underboss, Vito Genovese, became acting boss. But Genovese's reign was short-lived. In 1937, facing prosecution for a 1934 murder, the famously violent Genovese fled to Italy. With his two superiors neutralized, Luciano from prison appointed Frank Costello as the new acting boss of the family. The man who rejected violence was now at the top, a final testament to the new era of criminal business he and Luciano had pioneered. Frank Costello's 20-year reign as boss was a peaceful, mostly nonviolent era defined by his diplomatic approach and a consistent effort to avoid bloodshed. He became known as the Prime Minister of the underworld for his ability to mediate disputes and build a web of political connections. But his high-profile style and his quest for legitimacy pushed him into the spotlight. In 1949, he reluctantly allowed himself to be featured on the cover of Time magazine. In 1951, this came to a head with the Kefauver Committee hearings, a televised U.S. Senate investigation into organized crime. Costello, now the public face of the mob, initially objected to being filmed, and a compromise was reached. Only his hands would be shown. For the millions watching, his nervous and twisted hands became a visual metaphor for his internal conflict, exposing his inner fears and confusion. At one point, Costello refused to answer any more questions and walked out on the committee, leading to his conviction for contempt of Congress and later tax evasion conviction. His testimony and his "I paid my tax" wisecrack was a public relations disaster. The external pressure was met by an internal threat, his old rival, Vito Genovese. Genovese had returned to the United States in 1946 and was acquitted of his murder charges. Lucky Luciano had had his sentence commuted after he aided the United States Navy during World War II. But instead of being released, Luciano was ordered deported to Italy in 1946. Luciano preferred that Costello continue as family boss, but Genovese felt that since he had been underboss and then acting boss when Luciano was jailed, and now that he was back and Luciano exiled, that he, Genovese, should be de facto mob boss. Genovese was a proponent of the old world mob, favoring violence in the drug trade, which Costello had forbidden. Vito bided his time, gathering strength and allies and weakening Costello in every way that he could. The Time magazine cover and the Kefauver fiasco being cases in point. The long-simmering rivalry reached a climax on May 2, 1957. As Costello walked into the lobby of his apartment building at 115 Central Park West, a hitman named Vincent the Chin Gigante, acting on Genovese's orders, called to him and stated, "This is for you, Frank," and shot him. Miraculously, the bullet only grazed his scalp. When police questioned him at the hospital, Costello famously told them, "I don't have an enemy in the world," and refused to identify or testify against Gigante, who was acquitted. But the hit revealed a small but explosive detail. Police found a handwritten note in Costello's pocket with figures that were traced to the Tropicana Casino in Las Vegas, which had opened a month earlier. The note gave the lie to Nevada authorities' claim that of minimal mob influence in their casinos. Shaken and getting older and getting tired of the mob life, Costello retired, ceding control of the family to Genovese. As part of the peace deal, he was allowed to keep his gambling operations in Louisiana and Florida. Lucky Luciano, still exiled, died of a massive heart attack while meeting a movie producer at the airport in Naples, Italy on January 26, 1962. He was 64. Vito Genovese became boss but suffered a series of major embarrassments. One for the November 14, 1957 Appalachian, New York meeting, which he called on bosses from across the country to attend to celebrate the elimination of the last key Costello ally, Albert Anastasia, who was shot to death in a barber chair on October 25th. And Vito's coronation as Genovese family boss. The meeting was busted, exposing explicitly to law enforcement authorities and the American public of the existence of a national crime organization. Genovese was sentenced to 15 years in jail on drug charges in 1959. And finally, in jail, his paranoia led him to put a murder contract out on a Genovese family soldier, Joseph Valachi, who flipped to the government and whose Senate testimony in 1963 exposed the inner workings and rituals of the mafia. Vito Genovese died on February 14, 1969. He was 71 years old. Frank Costello lived out his final years in relative peace. He remained a respected figure, still consulted by other capos for advice and arbitration. He focused on gardening and horticulture. And on February 18, 1973, he died peacefully of a heart attack at age 82, a very rich and free man. So goes the story of Frank Costello. His legacy is one of stark contrast. He was a mob boss who never carried a gun, who testified without taking the fifth, and who died in his own bed. He was the mob's great experiment in modernization, the man who understood that money and influence were more powerful than fear and violence. He may not have been a traditional gangster, but Frank Costello was arguably one of the most successful of all time. He was the prime minister who had built his empire not on blood, but on a more enduring and insidious foundation, political corruption. And his blueprint still echoes in the halls of power today. And in the comments below, let me know if you think that Frank Costello should have had Vito Genovese taken out early on, knowing about his blind ambitions. I'm James Jenkins. If you've enjoyed this episode, hit that like button, subscribe, and share. And stay tuned for another episode of James on the Mob. And remember, life is short, so don't whack it off. See yous.